Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time when kings were not exactly noble, not especially wise, and certainly not very hygienic. In fact, most of them behaved like overgrown teenagers with too much wine, too much power, and not nearly enough self-awareness. So, tuck yourself in, let the day slip away, and let's wander softly into the world of history's most debauched kings. Men who could have been remembered for statesmanship or bravery, but usually ended up remembered for parties, mistresses, or the fact that they once tried to joust while already drunk. Because of course they did. Let's begin with a favorite, Charles II of Spain. Now, Charles was born in 1661 into the illustrious Habsburg dynasty, a dynasty famous not just for ruling half of Europe, but for marrying its cousins, over and over and over. The family tree resembled more of a tangled hedge. Charles was the very end product of this hedge, and the hedge had not been kind. His nickname was El Hechizado, the Bewitched, because people genuinely thought he had been cursed. His jaw was so distorted from generations of inbreeding that he couldn't chew food properly. He had trouble speaking clearly. He had almost no education because everyone assumed he was too fragile to learn, and he was constantly ill. Still, he was the king, which meant people had to treat him with respect, even when he was sitting silently in a corner, drooling a little, looking like a worried turnip. Charles' reign was one long decline. Spain's empire was collapsing. Its treasury was empty. Its armies were barely functioning. And Charles himself spent most of his life in bed, surrounded by priests, doctors, and hopeful advisors waiting for him to miraculously sire an heir. Spoiler, he did not. He married twice, both times to young princesses imported to Spain like royal band-aids. Neither marriage produced a child, because Charles' body simply wasn't capable. His autopsy, when he finally died at the age of 38, revealed a body full of horrors. A heart the size of a walnut, black lungs, intestines filled with pus, and, just for fun, one testicle that had never descended. So yes, the Habsburg dynasty's centuries-long tradition of cousin marriage ended right there, with Charles, bewitched, broken, and baffled. Naturally, the Spanish crown was thrown into chaos after his death, leading to the War of the Spanish Succession, all because generations of royals thought it was a great idea to marry their niece. Again, now, let's drift over to France, to Louis XV. Louis, known as Louis the Beloved early in his reign, somehow ended up being Louis the Not-So-Beloved by the time he died. He began as a promising young monarch in the 1700s, handsome, charming, with that kind of powdered wig glow that only an 18th century oil painter could love. And then, he grew up. Louis XV became legendary for two things: indecisiveness and women. Lots of women. The man collected mistresses the way modern people collect apps on their phone. You didn't really need all of them, but you downloaded them anyway. His most famous mistress was Madame de Pompadour, beautiful, clever, and talented at holding his attention, at least for a while. But Pompadour wasn't the end. As Louis grew older, he wanted younger companions. And by younger, I mean disturbingly young. In his later years, Louis built a private brothel inside Versailles called the Parc aux Cerfs, literally, the Deer Park. where a steady rotation of adolescent girls were kept for his pleasure. Recruited from modest families, they were hidden away in small apartments and summoned to his chambers when he desired. It was creepy, exploitative, and entirely normalized at the time, because he was the king. By the time Louis XV died in 1774, his reputation was ruined. People whispered about his secret harem, about his arrogance, and about the way the monarchy had drifted into decadence while the people starved. In fact, his funeral procession was so unpopular that crowds mocked him as his coffin passed. Not exactly the beloved ending he might have hoped for. But again, he was royalty, which meant that no matter how inappropriate his behavior was, everyone had to pretend it was dignified, even when it wasn't. Let's drift further back, to England, to Henry VIII. Now, Henry is famous for many things: splitting from the Catholic Church, beheading 2 of his 6 wives, starting the English Reformation. But let's be honest, what most people remember about Henry VIII is that he was, essentially, a spoiled man-child with an eating problem. When he was young, Henry was athletic, handsome, and charming. He could joust, dance, and compose music. By the end of his life, however, he had ballooned to over 300 pounds. His leg ulcers oozed constantly, making him smell like a rotting side of beef. And his temper. Oh, his temper. If Henry didn't get what he wanted, someone usually lost their head. Wives, advisors, even close friends, all disposable. Henry wanted a male heir above all else, and when his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, didn't provide one, he demanded a divorce. The Pope said no. Henry said, "Fine, I'll make my own church." And that, essentially, is how England became Protestant, all because Henry couldn't take no for an answer. Of course, his famous parade of wives ended in chaos. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. And yet, after all the drama, the heir who stabilized England was not a son at all. It was his daughter, Elizabeth I. Henry's personal life was messy, bloody, and tragic, and yet he was remembered as one of England's most iconic kings. Probably not for his leadership, probably more for the fact that no one could quite believe how dramatic his love life was. Let's move softly to Rome, to Caligula. Now, when people say the word debauched, Caligula is usually the poster child. Emperor from the year 37 to 41 CE, a man whose reign lasted only 4 years, and yet is remembered as one of the most outrageous in Roman history. To be fair, Roman historians loved exaggerating, so not every story about Caligula is reliable, but even the believable ones are. Unsettling. He spent lavishly on games and spectacles. He demanded to be worshipped as a living god. He supposedly built a palace for his favorite horse, Incitatus, complete with marble stalls and jeweled collars. Some sources even claimed he planned to make the horse a consul, because why not? Caligula also enjoyed humiliating senators, seducing other men's wives, and parading his own sisters around as mistresses. His appetite for excess was legendary. His temper, even worse. Eventually, his guards had enough. In 41 CE, they cornered him in a passageway and stabbed him repeatedly, leaving his body in the dirt. Not exactly a peaceful bedtime story ending, but a reminder that Even in ancient Rome, there were limits to what people would tolerate, even from someone with a very fancy horse. And now, let's drift to one more for tonight's section. Christian VII of Denmark. Christian became king in 1766 at the age of just 17, which, frankly, is too young for anyone to be given absolute power. Christian's reign was marked by mental illness, paranoia, and a complete inability to rule. He spent much of his time engaged in, well, let's call it personal activities, alone. Frequently, his advisors noted that he was rarely without his favorite pastime. He also enjoyed pranks, like slapping nobles in the face during formal dinners, running naked through the palace, and staging impromptu boxing matches. Because he was the king, and no one could really stop him. His marriage to Caroline Matilda, the sister of Britain's George III, was a disaster. He ignored her almost completely. Instead, he struck up an intense friendship with his physician, Johann Struensee. Struensee effectively became the ruler of Denmark, implementing Enlightenment reforms while Christian, well, entertained himself. Eventually, the court grew tired of Struensee's influence, and in 1772, he was arrested and executed. Christian was left isolated and unstable, while his wife was exiled. The kingdom stumbled on. Christian VII lived until 1808, but was king only in name for most of his life. His reign, like so many of these debauched rulers, was defined not by leadership, but by chaos, scandal, and the unfortunate reality that putting crowns on unstable teenagers rarely ends well. And with that, let's take a breath. We've wandered through Spain, France, England, Rome, and Denmark, meeting kings who were more chaotic than competent, who ruled not with wisdom, but with whims. And yet, they were kings. And so, everyone bowed anyway. Let's drift onward, but softly because there are more royal disasters waiting. Hey, everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to the 12th century, to castles, crusades, and men in chainmail who were convinced that God really wanted them to swing a sword in the Holy Land. Yes, we're talking about the Knights Templar, an order of warrior monks who somehow became both the most feared fighters of their age, and eventually, the most suspicious bankers. Their story begins with noble intentions, gets wrapped in glory, and then ends in a bonfire. Because of course it does. So, let's sink into the candlelight, the distant sound of church bells, and the strangely bureaucratic world of medieval holy warfare. The Templars were founded in 1119 in Jerusalem, which sounds grand, until you realize it was 9 slightly confused knights led by a Frenchman named Hugues de Payens. Their original job was quite practical: protect Christian pilgrims traveling to and from the Holy City. Because, believe it or not, a barefoot peasant wandering down dusty roads in sandals was a prime target for bandits. Apparently, even when your goal was to worship at the Holy Sepulchre, someone still wanted to mug you on the way. So Hugues and his little band offered themselves as holy bodyguards, and they made a very dramatic vow: poverty, chastity, obedience, the usual monk package. Except, unlike monks, they also carried swords, which made them both intimidating and slightly contradictory. Still, people loved the idea. The king of Jerusalem gave them a base on the Temple Mount, near the ruins of Solomon's Temple. And from that bit of marketing genius, they got their name, poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, or, as we know them, the Knights Templar. At first, they were not especially glamorous, just a handful of men with rusty armor. But then came Bernard of Clairvaux, a monk with the medieval equivalent of a Twitter following. Bernard wrote a passionate endorsement of the Templars, insisting they were God's chosen warriors. He even described them as fearless, humble, and incorruptible, which is a little ironic given how things turned out later. Thanks to Bernard's PR campaign, the Templars suddenly became very fashionable. Noble families began sending their sons to join. Donations poured in. Castles, estates, entire villages were gifted to them. And very quickly, this poor order was rolling in land, wealth, and influence. They wore simple white mantles with a red cross, symbolizing purity and sacrifice. But beneath the white robes, there was iron armor, well-trained cavalry, and the unsettling determination of men who thought dying in battle guaranteed eternal salvation. Not exactly the kind of people you wanted to meet on the opposite side of a battlefield. And the Templars proved themselves. In the Crusader states, they became the backbone of defense. Their castles dotted the landscape, fortresses like Safed, Gaza, and Tortosa, each one a stone reminder that the Templars weren't just monks, they were landlords, very serious landlords. When Muslim armies swept against the Crusader states, the Templars often rode at the front. Their discipline and heavy cavalry charges earned them a reputation for ferocity. Even Muslim chroniclers admitted they were formidable, stubborn men who simply refused to run away, even when vastly outnumbered, which, admittedly, is both brave and slightly suicidal. But bravery doesn't pay the bills, and the Templars had plenty of bills, feeding thousands of knights, horses, and retainers required money, lots of money. So they innovated. They created one of the earliest forms of international banking. A pilgrim could deposit money in a Templar house in London and withdraw it in Jerusalem. No need to carry gold through dangerous roads. It was safe, convenient, and naturally, the Templars charged a fee. Soon, kings and nobles were entrusting the order with their treasuries. The Templars became moneylenders, tax collectors, and financial advisors. They were warriors, yes, but they were also accountants. And nothing says romantic medieval chivalry quite like a balance sheet. By the mid-13th century, the Templars were at their height. Thousands of members across Europe, dozens of castles in the Holy Land, enormous estates in France, England, and Spain. But power invites envy, and success invites suspicion. Their downfall began with failure. The Crusader states collapsed one by one. Jerusalem was lost. Then Acre. By 1291, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land had fallen. The Templars retreated to Cyprus, then back to Europe. Their entire original purpose, protecting pilgrims, had evaporated. So now you had a wealthy, armed religious order with no war to fight, which is always an awkward situation. Kings looked at the Templars' treasure and thought, well, wouldn't that look better in my treasury? And one king, in particular, decided to do something about it. Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair, which is ironic because he was neither fair-minded nor especially attractive. His reign was expensive, His wars drained the coffers, and his debts to the Templars were massive. So Philip decided that instead of paying them back, he would accuse them of heresy. Classic move. In 1307, on Friday the 13th. Yes, that's where the superstition comes from. Philip ordered the arrest of every Templar in France. The charges were sensational: spitting on the cross, worshipping a mysterious head idol, indecent initiation rituals. You name it, Philip's men accused them of it. Torture, naturally, encouraged confessions. Men confessed to whatever was suggested, just to make the pain stop. And Philip paraded these confessions as proof. The Pope, Clement V, was pressured into dissolving the order. Templar lands were seized. Their wealth was transferred, at least on paper, to the Knights Hospitaller, though Philip made sure plenty ended up in his own pockets. The final act came in 1314. The last Grand Master of the order, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in Paris. According to legend, as the flames rose, he cursed both Philip and Clement, predicting they would soon face God's judgment. And, strangely enough, both men were dead within a year, which certainly helped the Templars' reputation for mystery. After that, the order was gone. The once mighty warrior monks reduced to ashes, rumors, and the occasional poorly written Dan Brown novel. Yet their legacy lingers. People imagine hidden treasures, secret knowledge, and connections to the Holy Grail, all because 9 rather idealistic knights once thought it would be noble to protect pilgrims on a dusty road. Instead, they became the medieval equivalent of an international corporation, and like many corporations, they collapsed under the weight of their own success and the greed of those who owed them money. So, tonight we've drifted through the rise and fall of the Templars, from humble protectors to fearsome warriors, to suspicious bankers, and finally, to prisoners tied to a stake, and all of it in just under 2 centuries, which by royal standards is practically a blink. Let's take a quiet breath here. We'll leave the flicker of flames behind and wander softly toward our next royal disaster. Hey, everyone. Tonight we're wandering into Paris. Not the Paris of today with its baguettes and Eiffel Tower selfies, but the Paris of the 12th century, which was mostly mud, smoke, and the occasional pig trotting casually through the street. And right in the middle of this fairly unimpressive medieval city, someone decided to build a cathedral. Not just any cathedral, a grand, towering, impossible one. A structure that would take almost 2 centuries to finish, and of course, become one of the most famous buildings in the world. Yes, tonight, we're drifting through the long, occasionally ridiculous story of Notre Dame de Paris. The year was 1163. Louis VII was King of France, a man best known for going on crusade, losing badly, and then having his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, leave him for the King of England, which is the medieval equivalent of being dumped on Instagram Live. But Louis wanted to be remembered for something other than being dumped. And so, he threw his royal support behind a brand new cathedral in Paris. The bishop, Maurice de Sully, was thrilled. His idea was simple: demolish the old, rather unimpressive Romanesque church and build something so grand it would make other bishops quietly jealous. Thus began Notre Dame. Now, construction in the Middle Ages was not quick. There were no cranes, no power tools, and no safety regulations. What there was labor, endless, back-breaking labor. Stone had to be quarried outside Paris, hauled into the city by oxen, and then shaped by masons who occasionally lost fingers in the process. Wooden scaffolding rose higher and higher, creaking under the weight of men carrying buckets of mortar. It was dangerous work. People slipped. Beams snapped. Sometimes, things fell on unfortunate apprentices. And yet, the work continued. Why? Because this wasn't just a building. It was supposed to be a message. A giant stone sermon declaring, God is very impressive, and so are we, the people of Paris. The style chosen was something new at the time. Gothic. Now, Gothic architecture didn't mean spooky gargoyles or dark horror novels. In the 12th century, it meant light, height, and lots of pointed arches. The genius of the Gothic style was that it allowed walls to be thinner, while still supporting massive weight. This was achieved with ribbed vaults, and most famously, flying buttresses, which, to the medieval mind, probably looked like enormous stone crutches holding the church up. At first, Notre Dame didn't even have them. The original design was simpler, but as the walls crept higher and the builders worried about collapse, buttresses were added. They spread out like stone arms, pushing back against the weight. Some contemporaries thought they looked ridiculous, but in the end, they worked. Notre Dame could rise taller, lighter, and airier than anything that had come before. Inside, the effect was astonishing. Sunlight filtered through enormous stained glass windows, splashing the stone with blues and reds. Columns soared upward like trees, and high above, the ribbed vaults curved together, giving the impression that the ceiling itself was floating. For ordinary Parisians, most of whom lived in wooden huts with leaky roofs, walking into Notre Dame was like stepping into another world, a glimpse of heaven, with much better acoustics. Of course, heaven took a very long time to finish. The choir and apse were begun first. By the 1180s, services could already be held there. The nave followed. The famous western facade, with its two towers, rose in the early 13th century. But cathedrals are like group projects that never end. Every bishop wanted to leave his mark. Every generation of builders had new ideas. So, while the basic structure was complete by around 1260, the finishing touches dragged on until 1345. That's nearly 200 years of construction, which means the stonemason who cut the first block in 1163 was long dead by the time the final pieces were laid. Generations of workers lived and died without ever seeing the building finished, which must have been both humbling and, frankly, a little irritating. And then there were the gargoyles. These weren't just decorative little monsters. They were functional. Each gargoyle was actually a drain spout, designed to fling rainwater away from the building's walls, which is practical. But medieval builders couldn't resist making them grotesque. Elongated beasts, demons, and creatures that looked like nightmares with wings. Did the faithful find comfort in worshiping under stone demons spewing rainwater? Possibly. Or perhaps they just accepted that medieval architects had a sense of humor. After all, nothing says divine protection like a horned goblin drooling on your head during a thunderstorm. Notre Dame also became home to holy relics. In 1239, King Louis IX, later Saint Louis, brought back the crown of thorns, allegedly worn by Christ himself. He built a separate chapel, Saint Chapelle, to house it, but Notre Dame still benefited from the prestige. Pilgrims flocked to Paris. The cathedral wasn't just a church, it was the heart of the kingdom. By the 14th century, Notre Dame stood complete, towering over the city, dominating the skyline. It was a monument to faith, yes, but also to persistence, and perhaps a little stubbornness. Yet, as with most things in history, the glory didn't last. By the late Middle Ages, tastes had changed. Newer cathedrals were larger, fancier, more flamboyant. Notre Dame began to feel old-fashioned, its stones blackened with soot, its windows cracked. Pigeons, naturally, moved in. During the French Revolution in the 1790s, the cathedral suffered terribly. Statues of kings were mistaken for French monarchs and decapitated by enthusiastic revolutionaries. The interior was looted. For a time, it was even used as a warehouse for food, which is not quite what the Masons of 1163 had in mind. But Notre Dame survived. Cathedrals always do. The real revival came in the 19th century, thanks to a novelist. Victor Hugo published The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1831. His goal was to remind Parisians of the beauty they were neglecting, and it worked. People suddenly remembered that the old, crumbling cathedral was magnificent. A massive restoration project followed. Gargoyles were replaced, the spire was rebuilt, and Notre Dame regained her place as the jewel of Paris. Of course, the cathedral's story kept going. Fires, wars, and most recently, the devastating blaze of 2019 that destroyed the roof and spire. But that's another tale. For tonight, we'll stay in the medieval centuries, when Notre Dame rose slowly, painfully, gloriously, stone by stone. Imagine the sound of hammers on chisels, echoing in the dusty air, the creak of wooden scaffolding, the low chant of monks in the choir, and above it all, the slow, stubborn rise of a building that would outlast kings, revolutions, and centuries of pigeons. So, we leave Paris tonight under the shadow of her towers, quiet, patient, waiting, as she always has. Hey, everyone. Tonight we're leaving the stone towers of Europe and drifting into the South China Sea, a place of glittering waves, drifting junks, and, in the late 18th century, a remarkable amount of piracy. And right in the middle of this floating chaos was a woman who began her life in a Cantonese brothel and ended it commanding the largest pirate fleet the world has ever seen. This is the story of Zheng Yi Sao, pirate queen, admiral, survivor, and because history is rarely fair, someone who is almost forgotten outside specialist textbooks, which is a shame, because she put Blackbeard to shame, and she did it all while wearing much nicer shoes. Zheng Yi Sao, whose real name was Sha Yang, was born around 1775 in Guangdong province. We don't know much about her childhood, which is historians speak for. Her family wasn't important enough to write about. What we do know is that, as a young woman, she worked in a brothel in Canton. This was not glamorous. Brothels at the time were loud, smoky, and dangerous places. Clients were often drunk, violent, or both. But Sha Yang developed a reputation. She wasn't just attractive, she was clever, She listened. She negotiated. She gathered gossip and information, which was often worth more than beauty. And then one day, her life changed. In 1801, she caught the eye of Zheng Yi, a well-known pirate commander from a long line of sea bandits. Zheng Yi commanded a formidable fleet already, but he was ambitious, and oddly enough, he wanted a clever partner. So he married Shai Yang. She became Zheng Yi Sao, literally, wife of Zheng Yi. Not the most romantic name, but effective. And here's the twist. She didn't just sit quietly in the background. From the start, Zheng Yi Sao insisted on sharing command. She handled negotiations, strategy, and organization. He handled battles. Together, they expanded their fleet dramatically. Within just a few years, they had absorbed rival pirate bands into a massive coalition known as the Red Flag Fleet. By some accounts, it included over 1,200 ships and 60,000 men, which, to put it in perspective, made it larger than many national navies at the time. So yes, from brothel girl to co-commander of the largest pirate armada in the world in less than a decade. But then, fate intervened. In 1807, Zheng Yi died suddenly, possibly in a storm, possibly in an accident, possibly helped along by rivals. The sources are vague, probably because no one wanted to admit they didn't really know. Now, most pirate widows in history disappeared at this point. They either remarried, retired, or were shoved aside. But Zheng Yi Sao was different. She refused to be sidelined. Instead, she stepped up and declared herself commander of the Red Flag Fleet. Naturally, the male captains under her bristled. A woman in charge? Outrageous, unthinkable, entirely unacceptable. Except, Zheng Yi Sao was better at politics than any of them. She consolidated her authority by building a governing code. She paired herself with her adopted son and lieutenant, Chiang Piose, as military commander, while she handled strategy and diplomacy. The men respected Chiang's courage, but they quickly realized it was Zheng Yi Sao who made the fleet run. Her code of laws was, frankly, terrifying. Loot was to be recorded and shared fairly. Disobedience was punished by death. Theft from common plunder? Death. Rape of female captives? Death. Desertion? Death. It was harsh, but it kept order. And in a world of cutthroat bandits, order was exactly what the fleet needed. The result was a pirate confederation that functioned less like a band of criminals and more like a floating empire. They extorted villages along the coast. They blockaded cities. They even levied taxes, as if they were the actual government, which, in some regions, they basically were. Naturally, this horrified the Qing dynasty. The emperor's officials in Canton fumed, but sending out patrols against Zheng Yi Sao usually ended in disaster. The Red Flag Fleet was simply too large, too disciplined, and, embarrassingly, better organized than the official navy. Foreign powers tried too. The Portuguese launched expeditions from Macau. The British joined in. All were beaten back, humiliated, or forced into treaties. Imagine the frustration of imperial officers, watching their own fleets retreat, while a woman in her 30s ran the South China Sea like it was her private lake. But even pirate empires don't last forever. By 1810, the Qing dynasty realized brute force wasn't working. So they changed tactics. They offered amnesty. Pirates who surrendered would be pardoned, allowed to keep their loot, and even given government jobs. Zheng Yisao, ever practical, saw the writing on the wall. She knew her fleet could not fight forever. So she did something extraordinary. She negotiated surrender on her own terms. In a stunning display of political nerve, she sailed into Canton Harbor with her ships, walked into the governor's office, and demanded conditions. Her men would be pardoned. Chiang Pio-tsai would be given a naval commission. She herself would keep her fortune and retire peacefully. And unbelievably, the Qing agreed. So in 1810, Zheng Yisao officially stepped down. She retired with immense wealth, married Chiang Pio-tsai, and settled into a quiet life in Canton. Later, she ran a gambling house. She died in 1844 at the age of 68, which, for a pirate, is astonishing. Most didn't live past their 30s, and so, she remains one of the few pirate leaders in history to retire comfortably. No violent death, no hanging, no tragic downfall, just a long life, quietly managing her fortune. Zheng Yisao's story is remarkable not just because she was a woman in a brutal, male-dominated world, but because she thrived in it. She out-negotiated emperors, outmaneuvered navies, and commanded more ships than Blackbeard could have imagined. And she did it all while enforcing discipline, maintaining loyalty, and making sure no one stole more than their fair share, which, frankly, is more than can be said of most monarchs. So tonight, as we leave the South China Sea behind, picture her fleet drifting silently across the water. Hundreds of red sails billowing in the wind, villages along the coast shuttering their windows in fear, imperial ships giving nervous chase, only to fall back. And at the center of it all, Zheng Yisao, calm, sharp, watching it all unfold. A pirate queen who began in a brothel and ended as the most powerful admiral of her age.